Welcome to General Chemistry Mini Lecture Series, Lecture 48, Hybrid Orbitals. Hybrid orbitals are obtained from atomic orbitals. And the number of hybrid orbitals equals the number of atomic orbitals used. The type of hybrid orbitals obtained that varies with the types of atomic orbitals mixed. Okay, so there are 5 types of hybrid orbitals, and that's similar to the 5 fundamental geometries. So the 5 types are sp, sp2, sp3, sp3d, sp3d2. And now let's count the number of electron groups. For sp2, there are 2 electron groups because there are 2 orbitals, one s and one p. They are mixed, so there are 2 orbitals. So therefore can accommodate 2 electron groups. sp2, that's 3 orbitals, one s and 2 p orbitals that can accommodate 3 electron pairs and 4, 5, 6. The electron geometry, they are just the same as what we learned in chapter 7. If you have 2 electron groups, linear, so therefore sp hybridization, that's linear. sp2, 3 pair of electron groups, that's trigonal planar, and then tetrahedral, trigonal bipyramidal, octahedral. Now let's look at the scheme. This is the linear. 2 electron groups can be accommodated. 1, 2. Trigonal planar, 3 electron groups. And bond angle is 120 degrees. Tetrahedral, bond angle, if they are bonded to other atoms, of course, 109.5. And this is a trigonal bipyramidal, 2 different angles. Among the equatorial ones, the 3 equatorial ones, 120. Between the equatorial and the axial, that's 90 degrees. And then we have the octahedral. Now let's use BeCl2 as one example to go over the sp hybridization. So Be, beryllium, it has 4 electrons. And the electron configuration is 1s2, 2s2. Use the orbital diagram, 1s2, 2s2. And as you can see, there is no unpaired electron available for bonding. So then, how can it bond with other atoms? Because of that, we conclude that the atomic orbitals are not adequate to describe orbitals in molecules. What we do? We'll use the hybridization orbitals. Using the valence shell electron pair repulsion theory, we know that the Cl-Be-Cl bond angle is 180 degrees, it's linear. We also know that 1 electron from Be is shared with each one of the unpaired electrons from chlorine in beryllium chloride. But now, let's take a look how the valence bond theory can explain all of this. First, let's take a look at the isolated beryllium atom. So we only concentrate on the valence electrons, which means just the 2s2. So we have the 2s2, and then Be also has 3 2p orbitals. Obviously, in isolated Be atom, those are empty p orbitals. The 2s orbital mixes with one of the 2p orbitals, then it forms the hybridized orbital. we call that sp, because we take one 2s orbital and one 2p orbital. That's why we call that sp. So those are the two hybridized sp orbitals. Then those two 2p orbitals, they remain unhybridized. Now please note, after the mixing, actually the energy for the hybridized orbitals, they are lower than the energy in the atomic orbitals. Let's take a closer look at the formation of the BeCl2 molecule. So we already know the isolated 2s and one of the 2p orbitals. After mixing, it forms two of the sp orbitals, and those are the hybridized orbitals. Each contains a single electron, which means each is capable of accepting another electron from another atom so that a bond can be formed. Again, those are the atomic orbitals, including those two, and those two are hybridized orbitals. Now you see one Be atom reacting with two Cl atoms, then bonds are formed, and the bonds are formed by the orbital overlapping. The first bond, let's say the bond on the left, it is this hybridized Be orbital overlaps with one of the chlorine's p orbitals. Those two approach to each other, then it forms this bond. And you see now the two electrons are shared by this chlorine atom and this beryllium atom. All right? So that's actually those two electrons now shared here. And the same thing on the right-hand side. Those two electrons are shared right here. So therefore, the two bonds are formed. So therefore, this is the hybrid orbitals. And what are those, you may ask? Those are still from the atomic orbitals. So they are not involved in bonding. Again, you see here, that's the two single bonds formed. Now let's go over sp2 hybrid orbitals. We are talking about the three hybrid orbitals now, and using Bf3 as an example. The central atom is boron. So we know boron has 3 valence electrons, 2s2, 2p1. 3 electrons we are going to need to form 3 hybrid orbitals. That's why we take 1s and 2 of the 2p orbitals, mix them, and then the hybridized boron atom is formed. You see, those are the 3 hybridized sp2 orbitals, and now the 3 valence electrons, you see, they occupy each of those orbitals singly, so that they are able to accept another electron from other atoms to form 3 bonds. And this one is still atomic orbital that does not involve in the bond formation in Bf3 molecule. Here is the simplified Lewis structure for Bf3. And this one shows how actually those single bonds are formed. For example, each of the Bf bond is formed by overlapping one of the boron's sp2 hybridized orbital, which is this one, with one of fluorine's 2p orbitals, which is this green one. And then 2 electrons are shared between boron and fluorine atom. So that's the case for each of the 3 BF bonds. You see, those are the shared electrons, and each of them actually is 1 BF bond, like what it shows right here. Therefore, in BF3 molecule, for the central atom boron, sp2 hybridization is used. Because there's no lone pair surrounding boron atom, so the molecular geometry is the same as the fundamental geometry. That's trigonal planar, 2-dimensional. Another example for sp2 hybridization can be found in nitride ion. Because the central atom has one lone pair there, even though the fundamental geometry is still trigonal planar, but the molecular geometry or the ion's geometry, that is actually bent shape. Now move to sp3 orbitals. Use methane CH4 as one example. Isolated carbon atom, how many valence electrons? That should be a total of 4. Okay, so therefore we'll need 4 orbitals. That's why we need sp3. That's 4 orbitals. So those orbitals are mixed and now forms 4 hybridized orbitals, sp3 orbitals. And now there are 4 unpaired electrons in each orbital. That's why 4 bonds can be formed. As you can see, there are 4 bonds in CH4. All right? So, because there's no lone pair on the central atom, the fundamental geometry and molecular geometry both are the same. It's tetrahedral. Another example for sp3 hybridization can be found in ammonia NH3 molecule. There is one lone pair here in NH3, so one lone pair on the central atom. Therefore, the molecular geometry is not tetrahedral anymore. Then it is trigonal pyramidal. One more example for sp3 hybridization, and that's water molecule. There are 2 lone pairs, so therefore the structure or the molecular shape for water is bent. Carbon is such an important element, especially in organic chemistry. So therefore, we'll talk a little bit more about carbon hybridizations. This is the unhybridized carbon atom. Okay, so the 4 valence electrons, so 2 electrons in the 2s orbital, and then 2 electrons in 2p orbitals, unhybridized. If carbon uses sp hybridization, then that's 2 orbitals hybridized. So therefore 2 of the sp orbitals, and then there are 2 unhybridized 2p orbitals remaining. For example, in this molecule right here, carbon uses sp hybridization. The 2 orbitals for carbon use to form bonds with hydrogen and nitrogen, that's the sp hybridized orbitals. sp2 hybridization, then that's a 3 sp2 orbitals, and then 1 2p unhybridized orbital remaining. It's like in this example right here, you see carbon uses 3 hybridized orbital, and the hybridized orbital, the type of the hybridized orbitals is sp2. Last one, sp3. All of the 4 atomic orbitals are used to form hybridized orbitals. And that's the example we just went through in the previous slide for methane molecule. Let's take a look at sp3d hybridization in PCl5 molecule. Those are the orbitals for isolated phosphorus atom, and here are the 5 hybridized orbitals for hybridized phosphorus atom. In this hybridization, 1 s orbital, 3 p orbitals, and 1 d orbital is used. That's why it's called sp3d hybridization. Here is the Lewis structure. There's no lone pair on the central atom, so therefore the molecular geometry is trigonal bipyramidal shape. If there is one lone pair, like in this XeO2F2 molecule, then the molecular shape is no longer trigonal bipyramidal anymore. However, the electron geometry would stay the same. The electron geometry here is trigonal bipyramidal, but the molecular geometry, one of those 5 hybridized orbitals is occupied by a lone pair, not by an atom. So therefore, in molecular geometry, we focus on the atoms, as we already learned that in previous lectures. So therefore, this molecule has a seesaw shape. The hybridization is still the same sp3d hybridization. Now in this BRF3 molecule, the same sp3d hybridization is used, but since there are 2 lone pairs on bromine, so the molecular shape is T-shape. And in xenon difluoride, there are 3 lone pairs. The molecular shape is linear, even though in all of the 4 molecules in this slide, they all use sp3d hybridization. Depending on how many lone pairs are there on the central atom, they have different molecular geometry. The last one for hybridized orbitals is sp3d2. 2 of the d orbitals are also involved. So therefore, that's 6 hybridized orbitals. Take sulfur hexafluoride as one example. There's no lone pair on the central atom, so therefore the molecular geometry is the same as the electron geometry, that's octahedral. Let's take a look at other sp3d2 hybridized molecules or ions. Let's say in BRF5, there is 1 lone pair. The molecular shape is no longer octahedral, so it becomes square pyramidal, because one of the 6 hybridized orbitals is no longer occupied by an atom, is occupied by a lone pair. If it's two lone pairs, the square is a square planar molecular geometry. 3 lone pairs, T-shape. 4 lone pairs, linear. But please note, they all have sp3d2 hybridization. Why? Because there are a total of 6 electron groups, whether that's all bonding groups or 2 bonding groups, 4 lone pairs, but the sum for the number of electron groups is all 6. You should work on those end of lecture questions. They can help you digest the materials we address in this lecture. And that's it for lecture 48. I will see you guys in lecture 49, multiple bonds.